Welcome to Chess Dog. Today we're going to look at a game where Hikaru Nakamura absolutely crushed the modern Benoni defense. It's an incredibly interesting, very tactical and aggressive game. This game was played at the Imre Konig Memorial in 2002, but the theory, the very aggressive theory of Hikaru still applies today. So let's watch this game and maybe we can learn how to crush the sometimes very irritating modern Benoni. Nakamura begins with d4. His opponent, Grandmaster Nick DeFermian, plays knight to f6, and after c4, e6. Now, this is usually the setup for the Nimzo Indian, but a lot of times Benoni players, after knight to f3, will go ahead and play c5, inviting the Benoni. The reason is this knight blocks this f-pawn, and white players often want to play f4 as quickly as possible. But here, after knight to c3, usually you would go ahead and get bishop to b4 in an Nimzo Indian or maybe d5, but instead he goes ahead, Nick DeFermian, and plays c5 here. A bit of a strange move order, but we do get a typical modern Benoni after the move d5, ed5, cd5, d6, e4, and g6. This is a very aggressive opening. Notice how these central dark squares are weak, so black wants to play the bishop to g7 and aim to the queen side. Now, in this position, black has a lot of different strategies they can use. They have to sort of wait and see what white's going to do and then craft their strategy based on what white's plan is. But white pretty much just has one plan overall, and that is to play the move e5, usually prepped with the move f4. Now, white can go through that process slowly, trying to nip all the counterplay in the bud and then do it, or you can just rush through it and play it immediately. There are different speeds at which white can play it, but at the end of the day, f4 and e5 are pretty much required. I mean, that is white's plan in a modern Benoni. And in this game, Hikaru wastes no time. He immediately plays f4. He's going through the strategy of white, basically playing it as fast as white can possibly play it. Very aggressive chess, bishop g7, and e5 just goes right ahead and plays it. This is known as the Mechanis variation. And you can do this too as white. Just play e4, e5 after playing f4 as quickly as you can. Black plays the knight f to d7, and now knight to e4, hitting this d6 pawn. And what this does is it keeps black from castling. If black castles, white just plays knight takes d6 and is just completely winning. So black has to do something about that. He has to take on e5. That's pretty much forced. And now knight to d6 check. And that basically draws black's king out of the center of the board. Now, with accurate play, black actually is okay here, but it's very, very scary. King to e7, so black has lost the right to castle. And here, a little bit of an inaccuracy from white is to just go ahead and take, because after knight e5, actually, black's doing okay. The rook comes to e8, the king tucks back at f8, and white can actually be in trouble. Hikaru plays the more accurate move here. Knight takes c8, check. So the knight is off the board, but so is the bishop. Queen takes c8, and now knight to f3, getting developed and putting pressure on the center. Rook to e8. It's a mistake to play this move because now d6, check, and the king is forced back, blocks in the rook at h8, and after bishop takes f4, white is just much better. So instead, he plays rook to e8, lining that rook up against the king. Now fe5, and here king to f8. Black could play knight takes e5, and this I think is the main line these days. After bishop to b5, hitting the rook, knight b to d7, knight e5, and then king to f8. Obviously, there's still a pin here on the knight. That there. And this is a fairly equal position. But king to f8, and now Hikaru doesn't waste any time. Boom! e6. Just keep, basically, you see what he's doing, just pushing and pressing and pressing and pressing right from the get-go. fe6, de6. Now here also bishop to e2 is not bad, with the idea of castling and opening up discoveries against the king at f8. Hikaru goes ahead and takes on e6, and now rook takes e6 check. The better move is king to g8. He should be getting that king out of the way as quickly as possible. White can't take the knight because the pawn is pinned. So king g8 was the better move. After rook e6 check, bishop to e2 to block that check, and now queen to e8. And believe it or not, this is the game's novelty. Hard to believe. But the idea here is to keep white from castling. The idea, if white castles, then the bishop on e2 will be insufficiently defended. But guess what Nakamura does? That's right, he castles anyway. And it looks like this bishop on e2 is hanging. And Grandmaster Defermian does take it. But the better, well, I don't know if it's the better move, but knight to f6 just allows the bishop to go to c4. Basically, he has to take the bishop because the bishop would become too active otherwise. So rook takes e2, but the reason that doesn't work for black is this strong response, knight to d4 check. So we have a discovered check by the rook at f1, and the knight moves to a square where it is attacking the rook on e2, and white is going to win material. After the king moves, knight takes e2. So now Nakamura has a bit of a material advantage. He actually has a rook for a knight and a pawn. It's not a huge material edge, but it is a material edge. So he's going to have to deal with black's slight initiative that develops after a knight to c6. So he plays bishop to d2 to challenge the bishop on g7 with bishop to c3, knight to b6. The knight wants to come into c4 where it hits everything. It's d2, b2, and even could threaten a fork on e3. Bishop to c3 to challenge g7, rook to d8, hits the queen moves, and now knight to e5. What that does is it prevents the trade of these bishops, but also places the knight in a strong central square. Queen to h4 hits that rook on d8, creating tactical problems for black. After knight d5, rook a to d1, and this knight is now pinned. The knight moves, rook would just take on d8. Rook d7 gets out of that pin by protecting the rook, bishop e5, queen e5, and here the strongest move is actually queen to c4, and then piling up on the pinned knight on d5. If the king moves, you take on c5, and now you're threatening queen to c8, winning the rook. Knight to c3 was played instead. Rook f6, knight d7, now queen to d8 check, hitting the king and the knight. The knight has to block with f8 by going to f8. Now knight to d5. The threat here is knight to e7 check. And when the king moves, you take twice, rook f8, bishop, queen takes, and that would be checkmate. So that's a very serious threat from white. So queen to d4 check was played, king h1, and now h5. Gives the king a little room to escape on h7, knight to f6 check, king over. Now knight to d7, piling up on the pinned knight on f8. The knight, the queen, and the rook all hit that f8 knight. The queen goes to c4. There's nothing he can really do to save the position. He does attack the rook, but the rook goes ahead and gives itself up for the knight. And the bishop can't take because if queen takes check, king h7, knight to f6 would be mate. Otherwise, he would just have to interpose the queen, totally winning endgame. So the king goes to h7, has to flee. Now h4 gives white's king some luft, so there's no back rank mates, and also keeps black's king from escaping via g5. Bishop takes, knight f check, f8 check, king g8, knight d7, king h7, and queen to e7 check. And in this position, Grandmaster Defermian resigned after king to h8, queen f6 actually leads to a forced mate, and the game is over. So a very strong formula for beating the modern Benoni defense. I suggest you try it in your games because it's pretty straightforward. Just f4, e5, knight e4, just go for it. So good luck in your games, and thank you for joining us at Chess Dog. Goodbye.